Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet Earth. It's also a pandemic wrapped planet right now. And there's a lot of information flowing, much of which is useful, much of which is distracting, confusing, some of that intentionally confusing or polarizing. This webcast is designed to take us in the direction of getting information that matters. Some of what we talk about here is related to journalism. Some is related to the wider landscape of how you make information matter. And again, in the middle of complexity, in the middle of systems that connect us, but that also often are designed actually to distract us. So my name is Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, building a new initiative on communication and sustainability. And today we're focusing on how do you maintain journalism that's impactful, even as the pandemic it's covering is imperiling not only communities and lives, but journalism itself. And there are two really interesting examples we'll focus on today and then build out the discussion in the next second half hour with some special guests who are just going to join us. And the idea is to not so much get at the great content in these two particular stories, you'll see in a second, but to get at the how. How do we do this? How do we spread this practice? I was at ProPublica myself for a year, in between being at National Geographic, creating some new programs there, and moving to Columbia. And it's an incredible model, and it's an expanding model, amazingly expanding since I was there. I was there right after the Trump election, and it was the surge in ProPublica, the need for ProPublica, and also in its impact and its innovations. Louise Kiernan is here, who's the editor-in-chief of the ProPublica Illinois. Sort of like, it's too disparaging to call it a mini-me, because it's doing really, really important work. But at the same time, it's this model of looking at the state of Illinois, and particularly Chicago, and trying to dig in and in ways that even traditional newspapers now are having a hard time doing. So Louise, and I also want to introduce a couple of your reporters. I think Akilah is here now.
Hi.
Hi, Akilah Johnson. Welcome to Sustain What? This is a journey. It's a question, right? Sustain what? I think we all are trying to figure out how to make information matter. So you guys in May did one of your signature projects where you combine narrative and data and point actionably toward outcomes that are not happening, or toward impediments to them. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're just structural. So I don't want to spend too much time on the meat of the piece. It's more, again, this conversation today is more about how it's done, the model, the theory, and how this could spread, again, in a world right now where journalism is in implosion mode, even as the story is exploding. So Louise, could you just start in? And also I see Duaa Eldeib is here as well. So I'll introduce you all briefly. Again, Louise is the editor-in-chief of ProPublica Illinois. Akilah Johnson, I want to learn more about what narrative health reporting is your specialty, and Duaa is one of the great reporters there, again, combining data and story and always in search of impact. So Louise, just, how are you all doing? You seem to be thriving journalistically, but how does this play out, and where do you see you can go from here?
So I'll start maybe by rewinding a little bit and introduce ProPublica Illinois. We are the first regional operation of ProPublica, which, as you know, Andy, and some of our audience I hope knows, is a nonprofit, investigative, nonpartisan newsroom established in New York in 2008. And ProPublica was founded out of the concern that as the news industry was shrinking, that the kind of reporting that was most at risk was investigative reporting, because it is the most time-consuming and expensive form of journalism. And so ProPublica was founded in the hope of combating that, and in exposing wrongdoing in order to create real world change. And over the 12 years now that ProPublica has been in existence, the organization has achieved exactly that, I think. And as ProPublica grew, the decision came about that what was really needed was to bring the model to local, state, and regional journalism, because that is exactly where investigative reporting has been most at risk. We've seen over a long period of time, and of course more accelerated recently since the pandemic, that local news is just hollowing out. And so we were founded here in Chicago in 2017 to bring the ProPublica model to our city and state. And in the 2.5 or so years that we've been publishing, we have published more than 200 stories, including well over a dozen major investigations. And those have ranged from an examination of how the city's ticketing system unfairly targets poor minority drivers, to an investigation into the treatment of immigrant children in shelters around the Chicago area. We did a project last year looking at how schools across the state of Illinois are secluding and restraining children in violation of state law, and many more examples that I could give you. But we are focused on uncovering wrongdoing and inequities here in our city and state. And as the pandemic hit, like most newsrooms, we were trying to figure out how do we bring what we do to this unprecedented moment in our country's or the world's history. And for us, that meant doing what we do already, which is bring an investigative lens to that, and that is what brought about this particular story.
And that's a great way to transition to the journalists doing the work. And I know you have to leave momentarily. So let me just ask you one question before we move to that more granular look at this process. Is ProPublica also established these independent reporting positions in other newspapers, newsrooms, which seems like another great innovation. I remember when that was starting to happen, and I thought that seems to be a critical thing, where you have that infrastructure of a newsroom of some kind, and you can bring that nugget of ProPublican thinking and doing in there. Is that working out too?
Yes, it is. And I think the way that we look at our investment in local investigative reporting is that it's a portfolio of efforts. So we are one model. We are a standalone ProPublica run newsroom. And then the second model is our local reporting network, where we support journalists in existing newsrooms around the country to do the kind of in-depth investigative work that they might not otherwise have the time or resources to pursue. And then our most recent initiative is a partnership with the Texas Tribune, where we've established an investigative staff within that newsroom. So those are 3 different ways that we're really looking to bolster local investigative journalism.
Fantastic. Well, here's hoping it can spread. Of course, the business model, is there a way for this to be sustainably invested in? It's a public good in so many ways. That's why the nonprofit models seem to be expanding. Making them sort of reliably there is the next challenge, I guess. But great to have you on. And now let's hear from the reporter writers. And I'm also going to introduce our great guests from South Florida and Puerto Rico, who are working for another important variant on this process. Here we go.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, Vanessa Colón, Almenas, and Nelly Torres. So what a great bunch of people here. And I think one of you knows the others. I can't remember who.
Yes. Akilah and I worked together at the Sun Sentinel years ago.
Cool.
Hi, Akilah. It's so nice to see you.
It's amazing to see you, McNelly.
Oh,
that's so good. I love it when that happens.
I know. Yes.
So again, we'll talk in a minute about the work of the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. But I thought maybe if Akilah and Duaa could describe a little bit of your approach to these projects. And again, not so much the results of this particular story, but what do you, as a reporter who probably was trained originally, like I was, more conventionally, pad, paper, do something. How does it feel to face this kind of a complex landscape right now? So maybe Akilah, and I do want to know more about that narrative word in your title.
Oh, the narrative word in my title. So that essentially, to me, thank you. First, let me back up and act like I have home training and say thank you for having me here and engaging in this conversation with you and my colleagues and giving me this opportunity to see McNelly again. So the narrative in my title to me just basically means that what I do from how I am approaching this is grounded very much in story and very much in people's story. And so, it is marrying traditional investigative techniques, data collection, holding power to account, accountability reporting, but very much grounded in the stories of people and people's experiences, and looking at how you have these kind of large government systems, bureaucratic systems at times can seem really arcane and inhumane, but at the end of the day, there are people whose lives are ultimately impacted by the decisions and the policies of these bureaucracies. And so I like to approach it by trying to meet where the rubber meets the road and really focusing on people and how these decisions are impacting people's lives, and then, look at it through an accountability lens through that way. So to me, that's what the narrative in my title means. And right now it's looking at, the lens of healthcare. Yep. Lens of healthcare. I have, talking about grounded in traditional reporting, I've covered a variety of things. And Nelly and I worked together a gazillion years ago at the Sun Sentinel. I covered, I was a night cops reporter and a day cops reporter, and I covered education, everything from the school board to minority issues in education, looking specifically at charter schools and what's happening in the classroom. And I think it's really important to establish that foundation, because I bring all of that with me to this current role. And I think it's what helps influence the reporting that I'm doing. And it's what really kind of, the stories like that Duaa and I worked on that project and others that I'm doing, it comes and it is informed by that base of knowledge that's really grounded in kind of your meat and potatoes of local reporting.
And Duaa, what's your sense of this? Again, the same question, this landscape. It's so different. I mean, I covered 9/11. I've covered climate change for 30 years. I've covered massive earthquakes, and we're facing an economic collapse it's like you combine them all. And then as Akilah said, you got to find a narrative in there or some way to engage readers. And again, with the ProPublica accountability model, you got to make it so it has some traction. Do you wake up in the morning just kind of like, oh my God, or how do you put yourself together and dive in?
I mean, it can be really overwhelming, because you do kind of feel this pressure to produce the best possible story and to shed a light on a problem that's not just, kind of a small problem, but like a systemic issue. And I think the stories that we strive to do, and the stories that are the most successful, are the ones that kind of go beyond the anecdotal and really get to the heart of the problem and why this is happening. And so with, the story that Akilah and I and some of our colleagues worked on, looking at the first 100 deaths in Chicago, then looking at the racial disparities, we knew going in that there was going to be some disparities. We knew that, that there were higher rates of underlying health conditions in communities of color. But kind of getting back to Akilah's point about narrative, we wanted to have the people stories kind of be the heart of the story in the article that we did in the investigation, but also use data, I would say, as the backbone. And so we FOIA'd the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office to get the data on the first 100 deaths. And that's where we found that, of the first 100 deaths were Black Chicago residents. And that's when we knew we had to get to work and we had to go beyond, kind of comorbidities and underlying health conditions and really understand the structural issues that set this into play.
And that's a good pivot to the work that CPI was doing down in Puerto Rico, which also took a big database. And this is, Puerto Rico is an island with a population, but Puerto Ricans are everywhere in this country. And it was must have been an interesting process to look at that diaspora in the context of the data. So maybe, I don't know which of you feels like you could dive into that meta aspect of this first, maybe McNelly, whichever of you
want to talk about that, Vanessa, or?
Well, at first I would like to introduce more about the CPI. Yeah, we are a non-profit organization created in Puerto Rico in 27. And our profit model is based on, local and US-based foundations in reporting grants and events and crowdfunding. And we don't receive any money or we don't have ads. So in order, to maintain our independence and our watchdog reporting, we publish weekly. Also, we promote our story, media, social media, TV. We have a radio program, and also we have alliances with more, at least like 8 or 10 online and print media. And also we have we developed a training offer for professional journalists. We are located here. Our headquarters are in the Inter-American University Law School. For us, it's very, we have a complex scenario right now. We have a more than a decade-long economic and fiscal crisis. Mm-hmm. We are in a bankruptcy process, and we have the imposition of a fiscal control board. So it's very, very complex for us to access to the information and to report. So we have a very special and very unique scenario right now here in Puerto Rico. Of course, the last July, our center unveiled an investigation that end with the resignation of the governor of Puerto Rico. Right. So that was a really, really a milestone in our history. So that's our introduction. So yeah. Maybe
Vanessa, if you don't mind jumping in about CPI, because it's just remarkable, for how long the organization has been. I have a long-time relationship with the two co-founders who are good friends of mine. And by the way, one of them is an attorney/reporter. And they founded this nonprofit in 2007, and it has grown so much, and they have accomplished so much in the past decade. And it's just remarkable what they have done. And last year was sort of like the pinnacle of that, because Puerto Rico has gone through some drastic financial changes that have pushed the people of Puerto Rico to leave the island. And it has not been an overnight event. It has been going on for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those Puerto Ricans, traditionally, they will go to New York, but now in New Jersey, because, it's nearby, but also Florida. And so this has been a huge diaspora to Florida for the past 15 years. For a lot of reasons. A lot of Disney went to Puerto Rico to recruit people years ago. But also, because Florida is closer to Puerto Rico. That's one of the reasons why I came here from Texas, not only to work at the Sun Sentinel, but I wanted to be closer to my island, the place where I was born and raised, because as a military wife, I have been moving around for so long, and I wanted to be closer to the island. So, so there has been a huge influx, prompted mostly by the financial crisis in Puerto Rico, and obviously after the hurricane, more people left the island. And who knows now with COVID, I don't know if that is also affecting in terms of people leaving the island as well. But the financial issues are basically what has prompted this migration. And this has been going on for decades now. This is just not a new thing. So I just wanted to add that.
There's one other thing I'd love to ask each of you, and I think the ProPublica team can't be here through the full hour, and if anyone who has to leave, if can just let me know. But one thing that comes to mind here, you're all really young, at least compared to me. But I still wonder about the future. Like, what do you see when you're thinking about your own future in journalism, or thinking about someone who's in journalism school right now? What does that landscape look like ahead? Does it feel much more like these nonprofit models, or is there still a role for commercial media, given what you're seeing in either Puerto Rico or in Illinois? Maybe we'll start with Akilah.
So I spent not this past year, the year previous, 2018, 2019 at Stanford as a JSK fellow. And we spoke a lot about business models and kind of the future of the media and the news. And I think that there's a few things as we talk about models that quite often get overlooked. And it's one of the things that definitely is not getting overlooked with the work that Nelly and Vanessa is doing. And that is the importance of connecting with communities that aren't majority white, and communities that, racially and ethnically are diverse, who are, speak a variety of languages, and really trying to figure out how to bring them into the news ecosystem in a much more holistic and sustained way, if we are really going to think about, like, as an industry, our kind of sustainability moving forward. And I think that is part of the quandary where we see ourselves right now. I mean, this moment speaks to that, but I think also not just kind of this moment nationally, but also this moment as an industry, is there's this disconnect between newsrooms and the communities they serve, particularly, we use the term marginalized, but that's Black and brown communities and communities that speak languages other than English. And so if we're really going to begin to think about our models and how are we going to sustain as an industry and grow and think about potential audiences that we have kind of ignored over the years, and as we're thinking about subscription models, and as we're thinking about trying to, donor models, we have to give people something that they want to subscribe to and something that they want to pay for. And that is making sure that you are telling the stories, holding power to account in ways that are meaningful to those communities, and not in some sort of paternalistic way. Like, you have to understand that communities get to pick their own leaders, they get to pick their own issues, and then you have to come into it with that same spirit and heart. So that may not be the answer that you were looking for, but I think more and more in this moment, that's what we need to begin to think about if we're going to really tackle our sustainability issue as an industry.
Yeah, that brings up a couple of questions I have. And Duaa, what's your thinking? 5 or 10 years from now?
You probably saw me nodding my head while Akilah was talking, because I agree completely with everything that she said. I think, especially investigative journalism is needed now more than ever. And for so long, the investigative teams at newspapers and news organizations have been overwhelmingly white, and so I think we need more reporters of color, more editors of color, because these are the communities that we are reporting on, and so we need to represent the communities that we're reporting on. So I think that's my first point, and I think secondly, we just need to invest in journalism. I mean, this idea that we're speaking truth to power, that we are, holding our elected officials, we're holding the government accountable, is so important right now. And so I think the more that we can, encourage journalism students to, pursue careers in journalism and subscribers to subscribe to journalism, I think the better it will be for our democracy.
Yeah, that, and for me, before we get to the next round, the thing that comes to mind is enabling community communication capacity too. I was in Flint, Michigan a couple of years ago for an environmental journalism meeting, and I learned about Flint Beat, which was started by a local journalist, publisher. Flint Beat was self-generated to serve that community's interests, and it's still like all of our efforts trying to find its way financially. But so I think, what can we do, or what can conventional mainstream quote unquote newspapers or whatever do to enable those components, so that communities and the journalistic communicators among them can kind of emerge? It seems like an opportunity too. And then to Puerto Rico again. Yeah,
I would like to add something. I'm going to talk to, about my own experience. I have been working more than 25 years in a commercial newspaper, in a commercial media. And I finished out. So after, 25 years, I came back to the university, to CUNY, to study. And I said, my friends asked me, why you are going to study journalism? You are a journalist. I said, no, I need to improve all my techniques. I need to improve my skills. And when I said that, I referred to, data journalism, because, and sometimes we forgot the training. How important is that the journalists can be aware how important are the, work with data, with Excel, with some formulas, is think out of the box. It's very, I know many colleagues and many friends that they're afraid of that. And for me, it's very important. I would like to add this to the conversation.
I couldn't agree more. I'm completely intimidated by many aspects of journalism as we know it now. I grew up doing this, magazine stories, and you had time and you could work with data, but it was a very different process now. So there are these advantages. And also, to me, and maybe McNelly, you can speak to this, one of the great moments, realities right now is your Puerto Rican community, your readership is dispersed. But so even though you're in South Florida and Puerto Rico, you're building an audience that's much broader than the old definition of a media landscape, which was a place. So you're building an audience that's potentially global. I think that's really one of the opportunities.
And that's what the online world gives us. And let me jump, because I was teaching an university course to journalism students on this semester, investigative journalism. And I really encourage my students, and especially diving into data. That was part of the course. I mean, even the ones who didn't know how to use these tools, because Akilah can tell you, I'm very geeky. I'm always been. And I always saw when I was in newspapers, I mean, I spent most of my careers in newspapers across the country, 5 dailies. But I always saw the online part of it as a tool for us to sort of kind of provide our audience with what we could not give them in a piece of paper, okay? And with the online world, we can reach a massive audience. And to me, that is beautiful. And it gives a lot of opportunities, like this website that you mentioned, Flint Beat, to journalists who feel that they have not been able to cover the communities who have been ignored by the mainstream media for so long to be able to do something that serves that community. And that's the way I feel about, me being independent reporter after, spending some time on TV here locally, that, I want to do the work that covers that matters to me, covering issues that affect people in the communities that really matters to me. And the Puerto Rican community has been growing across from the island, okay? Because remember, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And I guess, there's a lot of people out there who don't know, and we have to press that all the time. I spent a lifetime explaining this to people across the country. So, and it's a reality. But, we got to cover all our communities. That's why we need diversities in the newsroom. That's why these nonprofit models are filling the void of all these communities that have been ignored for decades. And we can no longer afford that, especially during a pandemic, where this pandemic is affecting communities of color at such a huge rate comparing to other communities. So I hope I answered your question.
Anything any of you want to ask each other about this moment? This is a good
moment. I want to ask Akilah. I mean, I kind of knew that she was in Chicago, and I just can't imagine, how big change has been. How do you feel about the fact that you are doing such a remarkable work with, working for ProPublica and covering, the African American community, because there's been so many issues. There's so many issues in Chicago, girl. It's like, you're never gonna stop.
Yes, issues upon issue. And so, like, part of our models, I'm actually based in DC, right? So I was working with this with Duaa. I'm one of we recently kind of opened an office in DC. So I'm one of our DC offices, and I'm a more national reporter. And so because of the history of what I've covered, I mean, you know this, Nelly, I quite often sit at the intersection of race and culture in whatever beat that I'm looking at, right? So I am looking at issues of inequality and desperate outcomes and treatments, be it in education or in policing, so in immigration, in politics, in race intersection of everything, really. And so I'm like bringing all of that with me right now into this healthcare moment, and as we look at the pandemic, but also just kind of through the lens of the pandemic and through the lens of healthcare. And I mean, it's a lot, it is a lot in that sometimes there are stories that come my way that I would like to cover that I don't think that I can't, just because of kind of the parameters on my beat. And then sometimes you just have to turn your computer off and walk away, because you have information coming at you in a variety of different places and in a variety of different ways, right? Like, there's what's happening in the industry, and then there's what's happening with the pandemic, and then there is, the uprisings against police brutality, but that also is fueled by what's happening in the pandemic. You can't, I think in the media, right, journalists, we do a lot of separating of things to tell stories so that they are, so that things are explained in ways that are almost simple, right? So if we're going to talk about racism in this moment, we're going to talk about and the protests and the uprising, we're going to do it in the lane of police brutality. But if you're going to talk about racism, I think you have to talk about it in a much more nuanced and kind of multi-layered way, because it shows up in our lives in a nuanced and layered way. It's not just, I'm experiencing racism in policing, I'm experiencing racism in healthcare, I'm experiencing racism in media. We carry all of that with us. And so it is using that, and that informs my reporting. But yes, girl, it can just be a lot sometimes. And in those moments, those are the moments where you lean on coworkers, you lean on friends, you lean on family, you lean on your group chat, and you just find ways to decompress and clear your head so then that you can kind of get back into this game and into journalism, into storytelling.
And I think I would just add one last thing real quick to that, and to this conversation we're having about kind of the changing model, and that would be collaboration. I think that there's just been a shift in journalism and in the industry, going from just competitiveness and just getting the story at all cost to really collaborating and seeing what the best possible story is and partnering with other news organizations or even internally, like Akilah said, she's in DC, I'm in Chicago. We had a report on the story from California. So we were all over. So that really helped the process. And like Akilah said, when things got to be really difficult, we leaned on each other. We were messaging each other. We were talking. And so that really helped, just that internal collaboration as well.
Amen to that. Collaboration.
Oh, yeah.
I would like to add something about the story because we have many difficulties in our investigation to collect the data. Because our investigation focused on, well, at the beginning in 3 states, but then we focused on the counties of the United States. But it was very difficult because each state collect the data in different way. So how difficult were for you, or how do you deal with that? Because the first question we asked for, how reliable is this data? How do you deal with, or how do you figure out an answer to that?
So what helped specifically with this story, and Akilah, I think you can, talk about kind of more national in Wisconsin, but with the first 100 in Chicago, is we had one source, which was the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. And I think they probably have some of the best data in the country, just in terms of just richness and just level of detail. And so getting that data from them was really helpful. That kind of set the stage for the whole story. Doing that statewide or across the country is a lot more complicated because of just you said the problems with how different agencies track how they count this, and so I think what helped us in this case was being able to focus just on Cook County and Chicago and the first 100. So the more we were able to narrow it, I think the more accurate the data was.
Okay.
By the way, that's where journalists have also been innovating. The Alexis Madrigal and Robinson Meyer at The Atlantic, they created COVID-19 data tracker as a way to sort of try to take data in ways and sift it and ground test it and sort of truth it out in a collaborative way. And Alexis Madrigal's in San Francisco, and I'm not even sure where Rob Meyer lives. And I've seen other collaborative efforts like that. Before you guys go, I want to bring in Bill Gruskin from the journalism school, who's checked in here, who might have some thoughts about both these integrative models and just the business models. He's focused on various aspects of this. Hey, Bill, it's great to have you here for the first time on this media Friday media chat. So, by the way, every Friday I tune this webcast into a media-focused question. Okay. So, Bill, you've been listening here. What comes to mind in terms of the future of this model, and if you have questions for these great journalists scattered in these places?
I'm sorry, I actually just came in like 2 minutes ago.
Oh. Well, one thing. Well, we were talking about. I thought we were talking about the ProPublica and the CPI business models, which are pretty much still nonprofit model. And when you think about collaborative journalism, you think about these effective efforts to do investigative reporting in an arena of shrinking resources.
Right.
What does that feel like? Here we are in a pandemic. That's the lockdown from it is killing so much of journalism, even as it's disrupting everything else.
So, I mean, the things I would say are things I can imagine all of you who are working in journalism know pretty well, which is that, without going back too far, the commercial market for journalism, as Andy and I knew it when we were getting into our careers, has largely collapsed. The 80-20 advertising circulation model has been kind of turned on its head. So now circulation, subscription, membership revenue, and that kind of thing has become, much more important. And we're seeing, obviously, all over the country and all over the world, really, really interesting nonprofit models emerging that have kind of a triad. And I once wrote something for the Evening Lab where I compared it to an orchestra. Like every big city has some kind of orchestra. Cleveland, St. Louis, they have great historic orchestras. Well, how do they support themselves? Well, it's really three sources. They have the program, the revenue, which is tickets and T-shirts and coffee mugs and that kind of thing. They have ongoing donations, and then they have some kind of endowment. And the beauty of that kind of model is when one of them starts falling off, then the other two can kind of help support it. The problem is, the Cleveland St. Louis symphonies have been around for 100 years or more, and you usually need some kind of big benefactor or do some Carnegie or Mellon or Bush or somebody like that to kind of give you the first big chunk of money, which then enables you to sort of go forward.
I found the piece here.
Yeah, there it is. Yep. And so I actually got a comment from one reader saying, well, what if I don't like the symphony? I was like, all right, what are you going to do? Obviously, any kind of business model that enables you to get out of the vagaries of the advertising market, especially given what's happened in the last 6 months, is helpful. The issues I see, and I'm really curious to hear from your panel, is what happens when you have one or two really big donors. I mean, for all the drawbacks of the traditional kind of advertising model, you usually had in any kind of news organization, whether it was a newspaper or TV station, you had a whole bunch of advertisers. And sure, if like a car dealer got pissed off and called the editor or the station director and said, we're pulling our ads, that'd be bad, but it'd be a few percentage points. I do worry more and more when I see nonprofit news organizations that are being largely funded by a very, very small number of entities or people. And a bit of full disclosure here, I'm on the board of the Lenfest Institute, which provides a lot of funding for and has kind of indirect ownership of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I've kind of seen that firsthand too, that you want to make sure that that no single donor or foundation becomes so controlling that they can really exercise a lot of control over the editorial, and B, that it doesn't become kind of an excuse for not doing kind of outreach that you need to be doing in your community. Even if you're getting 1,000 people paying $25 a year or $50 a year, that's big. That's significant. It may not be significant in terms of your economic base immediately, but especially if you're growing that over time, it shows that you're building loyalty and kinship, and sometimes even kind of emotional affection for what it is that you're doing, and that's just really, really important.
Huh. So, what are any reactions to that from the others here?
No, I think that he's absolutely right. That the nonprofit model, you need to, I co-founded a nonprofit here in Florida, and you need to diversify your stream of revenue and funding, and create, a support system that is diverse, because that's the only way that you're gonna survive. There's a good model in Spain that I heard last year when I was at the NHA convention. I cannot remember the name right now, but they do a lot of things. They have subscribers, they do events, and it's just a really good way to not only connect with the audience, but also to build that loyal, funding source. And they have some terrific ideas. I was really impressed with that group when I saw a presentation by one of the founders of it.
I want to add one more voice here. Hold on one second. We have Steve Waldman waiting in the studio from whose focus is Report for America, which I've heard of Teach for America, and there's lots of models. It's just another way to get at this. So let's bring him on.
Well, Andy, I need to say
if you have to go, no, it's fine.
Perfect.
Yeah,
bye.
Hasta luego. Let's have you back. I want to try to sustain these conversations so we can take it to another step down the line. It's wonderful to have you both here, McNelly and Vanessa.
And by the way, here in CPI, we have 3 reporters for the report from America. Yeah. Rafael. Yeah, 3 reporters. So it's a pleasure. Bye.
I'm mentoring one of them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh,
We're
Yeah.
very, very, very proud of
you.
being part of helping CPI. We brag on that all the time.
Thank
Great.
you. Bye.
Take care, Vanessa, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for having us.
McNelly, can you stay a tiny bit longer?
I can stay a tiny bit longer.
That would be great. And so again, Vanessa, thank you very much. So, Steve, maybe you can kind of outline how Report for America works, and I'd like to hear that sort of bifocal conversation, a little bit about McNelly as a mentor of one of your reporters.
Yeah, well, it's loosely modeled after Teach for America, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps. We describe it as a national service program for journalists to goes into local newsrooms to report on undercovered issues and communities. And essentially, structurally, the way it works is we have 2 competitions. We have a competition among newsrooms to apply for these great reporters, subsidized reporters, and then we have competition among would-be reporters. And it's quite competitive. And we've just placed 225 reporters into the field in June, or a few weeks ago. And then we pay half the salary, and the newsroom is responsible for the other half of the salary, but we work with them often to help them raise that money from the community. And that's the sort of basic structure of it. So the reporters have then become employees of those newsrooms, not of Report for America. They make the final choice on who the reporters are. And they may have specific requests, like CPI, wanted people who really understood Puerto Rico. And so, we focused on finding them applicants or candidates that really understood Puerto Rico. And the beats that they do are driven by the news organizations themselves. We don't say, this year we're going to do criminal justice, or this year our focus is healthcare. They define the core question on the application for newsrooms is, what are the biggest gaps? What are important gaps in your community? And how would you use a Report for America person to address those gaps? So it's a very interesting also window into what local editors believe the gaps are. We had before, 6 months ago, we had 3 different publications in Minneapolis apply to us saying we need reporters around race. We didn't really know. It sounded good to us. We were not in a position to know why, but it certainly turned out that they knew something there, that was a topic that needed to be covered. Fascinating.
Now, it seems like it's part of the symphony that Bill described.
Absolutely. And yes, I always come with a soundtrack. Absolutely, I totally agree that the nonprofit sector is going to have to play a bigger role in local communities, and that we just have to get used to that. We just have to accept that fact. And for a long time, we were a little bit paralyzed by this hope that there was going to be some new app that came along that solved the local news crisis, or that the commercial market would figure it out, which is understandable. It had been working well for a long time. But the nature of the collapse and the way that the digital economy has affected local news is very deep, and the advertising-based model is not going to come back at the level that supports the kind of especially labor-intensive accountability reporting on the local level. Right. I do think it's going to have a role. I suspect that a lot of communities are going to be a mix. There will be a commercial entity, but that a lot of the kind of really deepest accountability reporting is going to have to also be done by nonprofits. So I love the models of talking about symphonies as a way of just kind of getting people's head in a different space. Like, you never say, oh, we're not going to have a symphony unless it's paying for itself through, ticket sales, right?
Right.
There's an understanding that there's a civic. Libraries are another example. We've long accepted the idea that libraries are something that communities help create or support.
Right.
And I just noticed this the other day. There are more librarians than there are local journalists in America. If we could just have as many journalists as there are librarians, we'd actually be in really good shape.
Interesting.
That's interesting. I was on the board of our local library for a long time, and of course, libraries are also trying to figure out their way. Even before COVID-19 closed a lot of them on how to remain useful, and many of them have taken on that function of a sort of a hub for information in their communities. Part of what we used to rely on local newspapers for. So I was asking the team before Bill, with the ProPublica reporters, to envision. Well, and you're at the journalism school, to envision what properties are needed going forward to feel like you have a future in journalism and to be effective in journalism. What's changed at the journalism school since I went there in 1981, where we were plunking on typewriters and literally cutting and pasting. And I'm nearby on campus when I'm on the campus, but how much of a scramble is underway really there to maintain that conversation about the thing that journalism does that nothing else does?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges right now, obviously, in the industry, and they're reflected to a certain extent in journalism training. I've been there since 2009, I guess, a little bit over 10 years. I was at the academic dean for about 6 years, and I've been a cranky professor for the last 4 or 5 years. So I think there's several kind of core things. The first one is even in the 10 or so years I've been there, I've noticed that the conception of what students have around what is a story, what is newsworthy, what is your audience, has changed a lot. When I got there in 2009, it was probably not that different, Andy, from what you remembered. It was kind of just as Twitter was starting to come around, and you still had to have an EDU email address to get on Facebook, that kind of thing. And print newspapers still seemed like they had a future. And especially in the last few years, there's a really interesting conversation, and not just around the whole objectivity debate, which obviously could be a whole another 2-hour seminar, but around just what makes something interesting and newsworthy, and what's the most effective way to present that. And also, kind of, how do you think about who your audience is? Because in a digital world, your audience is infinite, right? It's no longer bounded by geography or by the limits of the antenna on your broadcast studio. And so it's and I would say the faculty have learned a lot from the students, in addition to hopefully the students have learned something from the faculty. But it's forced us to kind of rethink the way that we train students, and also just the way you present things. So there's certain things that we still try to, have a codified kind of thinking around ethics, around the basic things like plagiarism and not lying to your sources and not presenting something that you don't know is true. And then there's this really interesting realm around, issues about kind of who are you serving? And it's no longer, I worked at the Miami Herald for 10 years. And we have a very clear kind of geographically defined sense of South Florida plus the Caribbean and Latin America. And that was our audience. And, obviously, especially in South Florida, it was a very complex issue because of the amazing multi-ethnic nature of that community. But nevertheless, it was a lot more straightforward than it is now. So, we could go on and on and on. There's a lot around data and investigative skills and that kind of thing. I would say that's the key thing. And then I've personally been very involved in trying to, we have a mandatory class called The Business of Journalism, because I think one of the reasons that we're in the fix we're in is that journalists felt themselves insulated from the from the business imperatives and didn't realize the close connection between the business model and kind of journalism.
I don't think that was a mandatory class in 1981, 82.
It definitely is now. Everybody has to.
No. Although I do remember oh my God, I'm blanking on his name. The dean at that time saying, "You didn't get into this to be rich. You didn't come to journalism."
That's still true. We can put that right next.
It is a labor of love and an obligation to the society around us. And it's great that we've seen so much of that here this morning. I think Nelly and Vanessa and Duaa and Akilah and everyone else I knew at ProPublica could be making more money doing something else probably. And
big time.
Having fewer headaches, fewer stresses. And that's probably true for you too. So we're like, there is that aspect of it. And that gets back to the public good aspect of it. It's kind of like so many aspects of the climate problem. Mm-hmm. We're not going to solve the climate problem unless there's a recognition that some of those aspects of it are not going to pay for themselves. That right. there are these gaps and by the way, with COVID-19, even more so. Individual behavior. There was just a report by an economist at the University of Chicago this morning saying that people generally are following the data around them, no matter what their governors or mayors are saying. That they found these patterns of people's mobility are a function of the infection rates in their communities, way more than they are what the governor or leader is saying. So what I'm trying to do at the Earth Institute, I work with the journalism school, my friends there, Mark Hansen and others on some innovations, but I'm trying to focus some attention on that bigger landscape of how ideas move, how people think or behave, how information translates into responses. And journalism, for all that I love about it, is a shrinking wedge of this explosively growing menu of ways to share and shape ideas. Community, we did a session here a week ago on enabling indigenous communities and the Amazon to communicate directly with the outside world to tell their story. So it's not just Scott Wallace, who looks too much like me and Bill and Steve. It's not, we don't have to rely on Scott Wallace to go into the Amazon and tell the story of the indigenous peoples there. And that's a big part of where we go forward from here. It's been great to have you all here today, including those who came earlier.
Thank you.
So I wanted to just end with a little round of a manifesto, but with a concreteness to it. Is there something you learned today or you're thinking about where we could do something different tomorrow, that we could collaborate on something, or taking what we're thinking about here one step further? What's a conversation that we could have with someone else to do a chapter 2 on this, or that so when you're thinking, as we said earlier, I think it was with Duaa, we're facing this unbelievable multidimensional disruption of everything. And as Bill was saying, or maybe it was Steve, but we are able to collectively experience things even across distance like we are here. So given the last 55 minutes, what would be a step forward and toward where we would go next? Nelly, you mentioned you do trainings too, right?
I do training. I've been a member of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Organization. I serve on the board, the only Latina to ever serve on that board. And I do training, I mentor, I take it very seriously. Last year, I have left NBC6 where I was investigative producer a couple of years ago, and I was on a sabbatical when the whole hurricane happened in Puerto Rico, and then I thought, I have never worked in Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there. I left many years ago. I built my career here. Moving around and working in newspapers. So I thought that it was time that I wanted to go back and give back. So that's how last year I ended up working with CPI on an investigation that we did on leptospirosis. But I do a lot of training with IRE, with NSA, and that's my way of giving back to the community. And I just think that one of the things that I have encountered all these years is the journalists are really, really bad at embracing change. And I think that's a human behavior. I don't count myself on that because I was a military wife for many years. So change was a way of for me. Okay, we had to move every 3 years. I had no choice, even though I hated it. So, and one of the challenges as a data investigative reporter all these years was like I was already embracing the online world, but in the newsroom they didn't want to do it. So, and I was not the only one. A lot of my peeps were. So I think that moving forward, we need to be. We talk about open-minded, but are we really open-minded? We need to embrace new ideas. We need to encourage people. You're gonna fall. You're gonna fail at something. So what? You get up and you try it again, and you try something different. You know, that's the way it works. I went to work for 3 years TV as an investigative producer. I decided by the third year, you know what? I really don't think I like this very much. I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. You know, this is what I like doing. So I move on. So I'm in a position that I could do it. Thank you, God. So I think that moving forward, we need to have all these discussions. We need to have the discussions about diversity. We need to have the discussions about all the communities that are not being covered and being ignored for too long. We need to have discussions. How do we bring young journalists that represent our communities? And how we can overcome all these issues that have plagued this industry for too long. The frustration is real. I've been frustrated for over 25 years over this, and my colleagues are, and we talk to each other all the time, and we see each other at the conferences. I love training journalists. I love mentoring. Anything that I can give back, I'm always happy to do it. So now I'm training some, like I mentioned, mentoring a journalist in Puerto Rico from CPI. I was really happy. I was given the option of two, and I said, no, I want the guy from CPI because I want to give back, to the community where I was born and raised. So I think that, that's pretty, I think that covers a lot, being open-minded, embracing change, embracing technology. There's all these tools out there that are built all the time that we can use to tell stories, how we can embrace all those tools to tell stories in different ways. We need to embrace all that so we can engage our communities and continue to do the good work. Okay? Journalism.
That's a great capstone to this conversation. You identified three things I think I can work on. One is to help you expand that conversation you're already having with like-minded, distributed people in the journalism community. That's what this webcast is about. And so if I can facilitate that, so much the better, and making it as diverse as possible and geographically as well. The other thing is, I think with Report for America, looking at what you guys have been doing, I'd love to do a segment of this webcast drawing on some of your journalists who are in the field. We could do a live connection to 3 or 4 people in different parts of the country at the same time. And to Bill, this is the first time we're on the same campus, sort of, and we can do a lot more together for sure. So those are my learnings. And Steve and Bill.
And I should say, Steve's been a great source of jobs and opportunities for some of our students. And, one of my students went to work in Montana through the Report for America. She's covering the Crow tribe up there. And
great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for being here today. I want to show folks a slide and say a little boilerplate because I'm very thankful I have a job. So on Monday, this webcast I'm doing now has sort of 4 chapters in it every week. Mondays are communication innovation. Last week was a collaboration between an animator and an ER doctor who had written that unbelievably haunting ER doctor diary, and it got turned into a cartoon. Essentially, it has millions of views. Monday we have Randy Olson, who's a master narrative coach who used to be a marine biologist and then a filmmaker. And Sunday, in between now and then, every Sunday we try to discharge the pressures and tensions and focus on songs and poetry. I'm also a songwriter, so and then Fridays again are about the media and the changing landscape of opportunity and the like. So this is Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, and now this great pause, as some are calling it. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment around us. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done with this webcast right now, share the link you've been watching on with friends and critics and circles far and wide, and get in touch with me with ideas for future sessions. There's info in that little streaming thing at the bottom of the screen. Thanks mostly to all those who are watching out externally, and thank you all for being part of this today, my guests.
Thank you.
Onward into the future.
You all.